Good morning.
Good morning.
Whenever we read about Mary, Martha, and or Lazarus, I always want to remind everybody that these are not disciples of Jesus. These are not among the crowd of people who are wandering around with him throughout the Holy Land. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus of Bethany were Jesus' friends. It appears that they were friends prior to his earthly ministry. They're just friends. They're buddies. Good friends, even. I mean, you can think about the relationship that you have with friends, that you enjoy seeing, and that's the relationship that Jesus had with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And when Jesus comes to Jerusalem, almost every time, he ends up staying in Bethany with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They're his friends who live near the big city, and so he goes to stay with them, obviously. So Jesus, of course, one of the major features of his ministry is healing. He runs all around the Holy Land, healing anyone and everyone who comes up to him. And now his dear friend and brother of his two other friends is seriously ill. And you would think, if you were Mary, Martha, or Lazarus, you would think, whew, that's good news. Jesus is our buddy. He heals everybody. And so they send word to Jesus, and Jesus does not come running. He stays for 2 days where he was, somewhere outside of Judea. This is how the translation that I read a few moments ago puts it. John says, accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Though Jesus loved them, he stayed an extra 2 days. This is my favorite translation currently of the New Testament, David Bentley Hart's word-for-word literal translation. And here's how he translates it from the Greek. He says, now Jesus loved Martha and also her sister and Lazarus. Even so, having heard that he was ill, he then stayed on in the place where he was for 2 days. Even so. I hope when the history of St. Mark's is written, it doesn't say, Rick loved St. Mark's. Even so. Whatever follows after even so is not going to be good, right? I love my kids. Even so. Don't finish that sentence, right? I mean, John knows how this story is going to end. He knows how this story with Lazarus is going to end. He knows how the story is going to end. And still he's like, this isn't good, right? Like Jesus should have taken the first train out of wherever he was and gotten to Bethany. And if John feels that, you better believe that everyone else feels that too. So Martha, sister of Lazarus, hears that Jesus is arriving. And he's still on the he's not in Bethany, he's just on the outskirts of Bethany. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him on the edge of town. She doesn't even wait for him to come into town. And then John says, while Mary stayed at home. He didn't have to tell us that what Mary was doing. I mean, Mary's going to do something later. He could have just let, well enough be fine. But no, he says, Mary stayed at home. Why do you think Mary stayed at home? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I won't repeat that, but yeah, I mean, Jesus is healing every Tom, Dick, and Harry, but we needed him, and he wasn't here. And so, Jesus is here, fine. I'll go out in 2 days, right? Martha goes up to him, and she says it right away. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Translation, this is your fault. She then sort of backs up a little bit. Maybe she realizes just how brash she's been with Jesus, and then she says, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. She's a little deferential, okay? But she's still... Yes, thank you. So then the action eventually turns back to Mary, who's still in the house. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They also say they followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. So she gets up quickly, and she's apparently emotional. She's so emotional, they think that she's going to go and be emotional at the tomb. But she isn't emotional at the tomb. She goes out to where Jesus is. And she says to him the exact same words that Martha said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's almost like the two of them, Mary and Martha, in the house for the last 4 days have been saying the same thing over and over again. If Jesus would have been here, our brother would not have died. If Jesus had been here, our brother would not have died. And now when he's here, they each say it to him separately. Same words. It's your fault. So what does Jesus do? Does he get defensive? Does he get angry? Does he pull rank? Listen, girls, I'm the Messiah. Just back off. I know what I'm doing. Look, I had a whole bunch of really important cases back wherever I was. I got here as soon as I could. Don't you worry your pretty little minds about this. I got it all together. No, none of that. He does not get defensive. He does not get angry. He does not say, how dare you speak to me this way? Jesus weeps. He gets greatly disturbed in soul and spirit, being reminded of the death of his friend and the absolute grief-strickenness of his other two friends. He gets caught up in that grief, and he grieves too. He weeps with them. This story is obviously a long one. It took me a while to read it. It fills up a lot of the Gospel of John. It's layered with meaning. The Gospel of John is sometimes called the Gospel of Signs because there are 7 signs which point to who Jesus is as you read through the Gospels. This is the 7th sign. The whole Gospel has been kind of crescendoing to this moment. This story is about Jesus being God, Jesus being the one who has power over life and death, who can call the dead out of the grave. It is also a story that Jesus is fully human, a guy who has friends, who he loves, and who laughs, and who grieves, and who cries. It's a story that shows us that even when we think things are over and done, that God can still intervene. Like there's no situation that is so far past that God can't do something to it. No one, when Jesus walked into town, was like, oh good, Jesus is here, now he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Like that's the furthest thing from their mind. They're all thinking the guy's been dead for 4 days. He's already begun to stink in the tomb. This story is over. This chapter is over. We got to move on. And Jesus is like, no, it's not. There's still more to be written here. And this story is also about the faith of Mary and Martha. I think we oftentimes think of faith and prayer as being this thing that is meant to be polite and neat and tidy, like we're supposed to talk to God as if God is our Victorian grandmother, right? You can't say the wrong thing, and you got to say it the right way. And Mary and Martha completely dash that. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. They aren't polite. They don't toe the line. They tell it how it is. Because they're his friends. Later, in the Gospel of John, on the night of Jesus' Last Supper, on the night of his betrayal, on the night before his death, Jesus will look at his disciples, us, and he'll say, I have called you friends. Jesus wants us to relate to him like Mary and Martha did. Not polite, not coloring in the lines, but when we are super excited, to share it. When we are happy, to share it with Jesus. When we are worried, to share it with Jesus. When we need something, to share that with Jesus. But when we are angry and upset, that it is also okay to share that with Jesus. And not only when we do that do we stand shoulder to shoulder with Mary and Martha, who did that, but we also stand shoulder to shoulder with Moses, who constantly got frustrated and angry with God. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the prophet Habakkuk, who opens his book saying, where have you been? We stand shoulder to shoulder with Jesus on the cross, who says, my God, why have you forsaken me? The very end of this story, Lazarus walks out of the tomb, remarkably. And he's there, and John tells us he's like standing there like a mummy. He's wrapped in these cloths over his face and around his body. And Jesus says to the people around them, unbind him and let him go. Oftentimes in the Gospels, when Jesus has an interaction with somebody and he heals somebody, there's two things going on. It's a story about a real interaction with Jesus and this person and this incredible thing that happens. But there's also a deeper meaning as well. So like last week, when Jesus comes and heals the man who was blind, it's an actual interaction between Jesus and a blind guy, and the guy's life's changed, but it's also about the spiritual blindness of the religion of his day and our own spiritual blindness, that sometimes we are blind to the things of God and we need to see again. When Jesus goes and heals a man who is deaf and he's able to make him hear again, it's a story about Jesus meeting this person and utterly transforming their life. But it's also a story about spiritual deafness and about how the religion of Jesus' day and our own can sometimes be deaf to the call of God. And when Jesus calls a dead man out of a tomb, it's Jesus utterly transforming this guy's life. But it's also about spiritual deadness. Just like we saw in the Old Testament story of Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones, who was a representative of Israel that had been spiritually dead and had been called to new life again. And when Jesus says, unbind him about Lazarus, he's talking about taking the wrappings off Lazarus, but he's also calling for our faith to be unbound. He's calling us into a boundless faith that isn't held together by politeness and how we speak to our Victorian grandmother, but a faith that is real and true, whether that truth is beautiful or whether that truth is incredibly hard. Jesus has called us friends, and sometimes it's us in the tomb that is being told to walk out, and sometimes it's us who Jesus says, unbind him, unbind her, unbind yourself, and let them go. Amen.